Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are. Welcome back to the Khalid and Tatiana show. We are your hosts, Khalid bin Walid and the amazing
Tatiana Durke-Host. And guys, don't forget, the Khalid and Tatiana show is the only podcast which brings East and West together, culturally, socially, politically, and we speak about issues around geopolitics, the economy, society, bringing in a different perspective than we hear in the West. So, the West may own the mic, but it definitely doesn't own the narrative. Hashtag reclaim the mic.
Hashtag reclaim the mic indeed. This episode is going to be focused on the Russia and US summit. It's going to be a lengthy episode with a lot of data, cold hard facts. So lock in, and I'm going to give this to you, Tatiana. This particular subject is near and dear to your heart. Let's start.
I think it's a very important subject. So today we're going to dig into three key issues. We're going to talk a little bit about the mineral resources deal between the US and Ukraine, because this is going to be the foundation of the next part of the discussion, which is that Putin, after the summit, which happened in Saudi Arabia last week between the US and Russia, has extended on the table an opportunity for the US and Russia to collaborate on Russia's mineral resources. And this is absolutely historical. So I'd like to provide some context, some facts about this potential relationship. And as there's been so much discussions online, to provide some clarity around what is gossip, about what's the truth, and why Russia would propose such a deal. And then we'll close off by speaking about outcomes of the summit, and specifically potential outcomes to get peace in Ukraine on the table, specifically in relationship to financial sanctions, frozen assets, and how to create a long-term economic relationship between Russia and the US. How does that sound, Khalid?
Sounds great to me. So, on that note, Tatiana, the real question is, will Putin and Trump meet anytime soon? What do you think?
No, I don't think Putin and Trump will meet anytime soon. Even yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Kremlin released a statement saying that Trump and Putin will not be meeting anytime soon. I think it's very important to take a step back and understand that whilst the summit in Riyadh was historical, and we really can't take the historical significance away from this, it was not a peace summit. One of the major outcomes, which was stated by both Rubio and by Lavrov, and which is going to continue in further discussions, is about reinstating normalcy in the relationships, and specifically the bilateral and diplomatic relationships between the US and Russia. And as Lavrov mentioned, remove artificial barriers towards economic cooperation. And then to achieve this, there needs to be trust and reciprocity within this relationship. So without the trust and the foundations for dialogue, there is neither going to be explicit deals and economic deals happening between the US and Russia, and there also won't be an explicit solution and peace resolution to the Ukrainian conflict.
Okay, I'll take that, Tatiana. But as somebody who isn't really informed about historic cooperation between the U.S. and Russia, you mentioned reciprocity. Working on joint ventures together. When was the last time, or can you give us a bit of a historical context behind that, if you will?
So I think this is very important. As you know, and as was announced in the news, and let's just pull up the clip of an interview that Putin gave just earlier this week, which made headlines.
Мы, кстати говоря, готовы были бы предложить и американским нашим партнерам, когда я партнеры, говорю, имею в виду не только административные, правительственные структуры, но и компании, если бы они проявили интерес к совместной работе. У нас, безусловно, на порядок, я хочу это подчеркнуть, на порядок больше ресурсов подобного рода, чем в Украине. Россия является одним из безусловных лидеров по запасам этих редких и редкоземельных металлов. Они у нас имеются и на севере, в Мурманске, на Кавказе, в Кабардино-Балкарии, на Дальнем Востоке, в Иркутской области, в Якутии, в Тыве. Это достаточно капиталоемкие инвестиции, проекты капиталоемкие. Мы с удовольствием работали бы совместно с любыми иностранными партнерами, в том числе с американскими. Да, кстати говоря, что касается новых территорий, то же самое. Мы готовы привлечь иностранных партнеров и так называемые новые, наши исторические территории, которые вернули в состав Российской Федерации. Там тоже есть запасы определенные. Мы готовы с нашими партнерами, в том числе с американскими, работать там.
So, as you can see, this was, you could say, in itself, a bombshell opportunity that Russia put on the table of proposing to the U.S. joint economic collaboration around Russia's mineral resources. So now this comes firstly in the context that the U.S. and Ukraine have been negotiating now for a number of weeks a deal around Ukraine's rare earth minerals. So before providing historical context, I'll just quickly provide an overview of what the US put on the table with Ukraine and what has led to Putin then making this offer. So since Trump has come into presidency, it's very clear that he thinks that the US has sunk money into Ukraine, has sunk around 500 billion. We can contest this figure because it's not direct investments, there's federal loans, there's grants, there's a number of different instruments which is used. But he's come up with a figure of 500 billion, so it doesn't really matter how he's come up with it. And in exchange for Ukraine to pay back the United States, he's asked for 50% of mineral resources in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine does have mineral resources. I'm not going to go over the whole periodic table, but it has two specifically important resources: lithium, titanium, and a number of rare earths, which are questionable whether they're actually exploitable or not. All in all, Ukraine holds between 2 to maybe 5% of the world's reserves of rare earths.
And in response to that, how much does Russia have?
20%. Well,
20%.
20%.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So an initial deal was leaked last week, as you've already heard, of what the US was putting on the table. They were asking for 50% of all future revenues generated from Ukraine's mineral resources. And of course, as you know...
It's interesting that they used the word revenues, huh?
Revenue, it's a very interesting choice because, as you know, revenues, I mean, this is before EBITDA, before profit. Revenues in the financial world is one of those financial indicators where you can be very creative with it.
Yeah.
And this document leaked. And actually, as you said, the use of revenues meant that there was very little details around it. It was all future revenues to pay back. And Zelensky went on television, said that Ukraine would never accept this deal, that he utterly rejected this deal. Apparently, behind closed doors, he had told Rubio that he would accept it. But we weren't there, so we're not going to make any claims which we don't know. And that he wasn't going to accept this deal and wasn't in a position to anyways, because it would have to be legally approved by his parliament. So apparently in this case, Zelensky actually does refer to his constitution when it suits him. This week, the deal was agreed. What is the deal? The US and Ukraine is going to create a joint fund, which in my opinion actually looks very much like a type of sovereign fund in its structure. Ukraine will have to put 50% of all the proceeds it generates from mineral resources and rare earths into this joint fund managed by the US and Ukraine. Now, again, the word of proceeds is a very interesting one because it's up for interpretation. There are no more details on the deal, so I don't want to go too much into the possibilities of what it could look like. Apparently, this is now going to be negotiated. But why I wanted to provide some context, because with Ukraine accepting the deal, this happened 2 days after Putin said we're open to explore joint collaboration with the US. And Khaled, you asked me about the historic context. So now it's very important to understand, why is this a landmark statement by Putin? Historically, there has never been any mutually beneficial economic interests between the United States and Russia. Never. We'll go back in history a little bit. This is very important so that people they can understand the nature of this proposition and why it's being put on the table. So you know, the United States was founded now over 300 years ago, but the first real economic interaction between Russia and the US was over the sale of Alaska, which at the time was sold for $7.2 million, which is equivalent to $140 million, so peanuts. Russia at the time, the Imperial Russia, was fighting a number of different wars, including the Napoleonic Wars, if I'm not mistaken, and had to sell this territory. And the United States benefited from it. I mean, now Alaska holds some of the richest reserves in the United States. It's a resource powerhouse.
Lots of oil and gas, yes, for sure.
Lots of oil and gas, but we can agree on this one, Khaled, that this wasn't a reciprocal. This was a transaction to help Russia, who was in a very bad financial state. If we move forwards a little bit along in history, in the early 20th century, there was, of course, the formation of the Soviet Union. There was some economic interaction, notably Ford Motors, International Harvester, who set up companies and production facilities, actually who set up 2 production facilities in Gorsky within the automotive industry. But these are very, very small partnerships.
This was in the USSR, really?
This was in the USSR, in Gorsky. Then, during the Second World War, there was the Lend-Lease program, which was probably the biggest program at the time. And for $1 billion, the US provided military equipment to the Soviet Union, which enabled the Red Army to boost its production, but most importantly, to be able to fight on the front. So again, this isn't as much a reciprocal relationship as it's purely import-export. The USSR, under the Lend-Lease program, purchased this equipment from the United States. And afterwards, we see a dearth. Obviously, it's the Cold War. There's very little trade and economic relationships between the US and, at the time, the Soviet Union. They're competing in an arms race, in an economic race, in a technology race, and in a space race. And this will be important for the future. But in the 1970s, there is the grain deal. And once again, the USSR purchases grain from the United States for, I believe, $1 billion worth of grain annually, which was quite landmark at the time. It actually showed a little bit of a détente in relationships and economic relationships. But again, this was highly politicized, but it wasn't true joint economic interest. It was a necessity by the Soviet Union to do it. And it's only really in 2012 that there is the first true economic and trade partnership between the U.S. and Russia, which was brokered by Putin, which
This
is
is the ExxonMobil deal, yeah?
it's the ExxonMobil deal with Rosneft, which is a state-owned enterprise, to developing and exploring Arctic oil. And of course, at that time, the Arctic has always been strategically important, but it's not the same that it is today. And this was a joint venture, which actually could have culminated in billions for both countries and really created a joint venture in economic cooperation and shared interests in a strategically important area for both countries. It was established in 2012, and of course, it was disbanded by the US in 2014 at what they called the onset of the Crimea War. And since then, we know the story and we know what has happened. So,
Can I ask a question though, Tatiana?
yes, of course.
As someone who grew up, as a science buff, nerdy little child, I was always interested in space, in this International Space Station. I remember growing up seeing the cooperation with NASA and the Russian Space Agency, for the International Space Station. They were using each other's rockets, they're using each other's equipment. So how does that really fit into the cooperation? I mean, did it stop? I'm not informed, really.
So the space cooperation is a little bit of a strange one, and has always been a little bit of a strange one because it was at the center of a Cold War. It was one of the main marks of competition, but also proving the supremacy of both nations between, Russia sent the first dog to space. It's actually sent the first people to space. Sputnik, Mir, and the US, of course, were the first to land on the moon. So there's always been a space race. And I don't think this is going to finish, because I think a lot of countries are going to continue in a space race. Space is one of those domains, and it's becoming actually increasingly important. Maybe we'll speak about it more, and I think we should speak about it more. But at the end of the Cold War, it's important to look at the chaos of the Soviet collapse. And this is actually where there was already quite a bit of American support, much less financial, but much more strategic in privatization schemes and policy making. Harvard Business School came in, the World Bank came in, and arguably, you could say that some of the economic downturns and chaos and also loss of trust in private enterprise today in Russia is actually due to the failure of the American privatization intervention that there was in the ex-USSR. But during this time, to answer your question, there was, of course, much more collaboration within the space technology sector. I may be a little bit biased, but Russia does have, Roscosmos is a leader in space technologies, an absolute leader in rockets and satellites, and there's a launch pad in Kazakhstan. I forget the name. Maybe you can look that up, where most large launches in the Eurasian continent happen there in close collaboration with the United States. Of course, during the special military operation, this was ceased. Any collaboration was ceased by both Russia and the United States. But during a period of 20 years, there was an exchange. The US actually bought rockets from Russia, bought technology from Russia, maybe a little stamp of approval that's saying that the technology is superior. And funnily enough, though, when you're speaking about the ESA, only last year, an American astronaut at the International Space Station and a Russian astronaut were together. So in a way, you could say maybe space has both been a point of acute competition, but simultaneously in space, a point of brothership and collaboration.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for the historic context, sorry, rather. I think I'd like to hear more about Kirill Dmitriev coming in and bringing in the receipts. Let's move to today. What can you tell us about what's happening at the moment?
Well, today, where are we now? And let's take a little bit of a step back, if you don't mind, because I think that we need to put in the frame of now why this deal was historically important.
Mhm.
What we've looked at is we've looked at the historical context. We've looked at the lack of trade ties historically between the U.S. and Russia, and now why Russia is pursuing potentially this strategy. And then we'll discuss a little bit more afterwards. But why is it so historical? Is it's offering economic ties, which is a clear indication of the outcome of the summit. It's making, in a way, irrelevant the Ukraine deal, and it's seeking to tie in the U.S. into an interdependent economic relationship to avoid future conflicts. And now we'll get to Dmitriev. So, as you know, Saudi hosted the summit last week, and one of the key negotiators was Kirill Dmitriev, we've talked about him before. He's the CEO of Russia's direct investment fund. And it was a very smart strategy, because what did he do? What did he do, Khaled?
I remember seeing the video. He literally is walking around with the receipts and going through them line by line, telling Trump people it's 1.3 billion here, it's 100 billion there. And I looked at the numbers. I have my own interpretations of them. But I could see here that there was 123 billion in IT and media, 94 billion in consumer goods, 91 billion in finance, and so on and so forth. But can you perhaps give us a breakdown as you see it from, let's say, what's the one that caught your attention? Let's go with that.
Well, first of all, I think it's a very smart negotiating tactic, because by bringing the 324 billion speaks about the direct, and I really want to highlight this, the direct, measurable, contractual incurred losses of American businesses who are operating in Russia and who decided to cease their operations in Russia. The number is probably much higher because it doesn't include future earnings, it doesn't include indirect losses, it doesn't include loss of competitive gains from, let's say, Chinese companies coming in, or
loss of
Russia,
market share,
loss
reputational
of
loss.
substitutional changes by Russian companies. So I think that this figure is probably triple, if not quadruple, the size. I actually calculated it for the European market. Won't get into it because maybe this will be for another time, but the losses are monumental. You know that this data wasn't actually available on Western websites. They said that the data was unavailable and was not able to be verified. I found it in about 2 seconds on Russian sources, and I would highly like to recommend to anybody who actually wants statistics on Russia, I'll put the link here, to very simply go to Rosstat, which is the State Statistics Authority. They're updated on a daily basis. So Kirill Dmitriev coming in with the receipts shows, and we've talked about this before, this is a deal. And if our two main outcomes of this summit and future negotiations are establishing trust, creating dialogue, creating reciprocity, well, this is how much you lost. And this is the only language which Trump understands.
That's
It's
what
a
I was
missed
going to say.
opportunity.
Yes, that is what I
What do
was
you
going to
think?
say. Yeah, I mean, it is very smart that he makes it sound like it's Biden's problem, you know? And this is the kind of language that Trump understands, you know? Yeah, yes, it's Biden's problem. We lost this much. You have to put it on a profit loss sheets for him to kind of understand how much he potentially lost and how much the current administration is to gain from going into this deal with Russia.
Exactly, because the Russian market is huge. And let's now stick to some facts and to some examples, because there's a lot of people who've come in and said 324 billion are claims. So I don't have a whole breakdown, but I have found some companies. Khaled, why don't you give us some examples of write-offs or revenue losses that American companies have suffered in Russia?
Well, according to my source, which is Tatiana Duqueiroz, Exxon has suffered 4 billion write-down in its Russia-related business. I
From
think
obviously the
that,
Arctic deal that we were talking about before.
yeah, but I also think this is a bit of on the low end. You know, I had a thought about this when I was reading it, and there are also middlemen that aren't really taken into account.
Of
So
course.
when the oil and gas products get sent to Kazakhstan or somewhere else, or when it gets sent to India, repackaged and then resold, they're not taking these kinds of things into account. So McDonald's recorded a $1.4 billion non-cash write-off. And what was the name of the new? I had it here somewhere. The new McDonald's, Russian McDonald's.
Oh, I can't remember.
Yeah, but
Apparently
it
they
didn't.
just changed the packaging. They kept all the outlets and
Yeah,
just changed the packaging.
yeah. The equipment was the same. Everything was the same. And overnight, my friends were telling me that they just switched to overnight, which is, well done for the Russians, really. General Motors, 657 million. I saw something here that also interested me.
Yes.
It was Disney reported 195 million losses in, and I quote, depreciation of intangible assets. And I did have a thought about this. What kind
Tell
of
me.
intangible asset
Yes.
Disney would have had in Russia, right? And I was thinking perhaps it was leasing equipment and
Okay.
leasing and future contracts. So something that they've already paid for and now can't actually get their goods and services back. So I don't know. We'll have to go.
We'll have to go into finder. I'd be in because
Mm,
it's probably in their financial statements. I'm also thinking royalties because
Oh,
Marvel,
yeah, Marvel. Yes, you're
the
right.
Marvel, Star
Mm,
Wars, all of those
mm,
things,
mm, mm,
very, very global. And
mm, mm.
don't forget the big one, which obviously made headlines.
You're talking about Starbucks?
I'm talking about Google.
Oh, Google. Well, you know what? You take this one.
Well, probably you've all heard about this, but Google had to shut down its operations in Russia. And it's very important to, again, put this in a little bit of context. It's been reported that Russia threw out those companies of the market, but it's not true. A lot of specifically the technology providers such as Microsoft, Google, SAP, which includes also Meta Group, some of the social media networks, stopped providing services to Russian citizens and Russian users, basically making those products absolutely moot and disrupting business hugely. I mean, imagine if you use Google Business for your everyday, you can't access any suite of products.
I was under the impression that Google and all of these Western companies weren't actually in Russia. Am I mistaken?
No, they were in Russia. They were competing with Yandex, for example. Yandex is the Russian Google. It does everything that Google does. In some cases, I would even say it does some things better. It's very, very tuned to the market. And I'm always a big fan of localization when it comes to these services because they know their consumers better.
I agree.
Same thing with Saudi solutions or GCC solutions. Karim, for example, is a great example. But without going on a tangent, no, they were very active and they disrupted and cut all services. Of course, then IP addresses were restricted. There was a little bit of tit for tat on both sides, but they were never shut down by the Russian government.
I see.
And they just stopped providing services. So if they couldn't provide services, you're not going to use them. And what happened with Google? Google's Russian subsidiary actually had to declare bankruptcy in 2013 with debts outstanding from failure to provide services and failure to pay its dues to the Russian states and different entities that it was working with. So this is when it gets a little bit petty. It gets even very petty. As a result of this very Russian trial, now Google has to pay reparations totaling 2.5 undecillion rubles.
How many zeros is that? More than I can
know.
count.
It's more than I can count. So I think it's safe to say that there's two paths towards this. Google will never come back to the Russian market. And I actually even think that today with substitution, there's going to be no need for Google. Russia is investing very heavily in AI. Or it's going to have to pay 2.5 undecillion rubles, or this will be part of a future dialogue, so to speak, between the U.S. and Russia, because tech companies have been hit. U.S. companies have been hit very hard by leaving the Russian market.
Well, you mentioned a very interesting statistic earlier, offline, of course. It was about Russia being a trading partner.
I know what you were. So that was a fun fact that I verified. Russia was actually the third largest trading partner for 3 American states: Louisiana, Texas, and Alabama. I had no idea about it. And Missouri has the highest level of Russian imports in the whole of the United States. So this is a little bit of a fun fact, but it's important to take it into context. Let's look at Saudi Arabia. What is the trade volume and FDI inflows between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. approximately, Khalid? At its peak. What is the FDI inflows and outflows between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. at its peak?
I think it was something around, was it 80-something, 180-something? I can't remember the exact number.
So in 2012, actually, it was around $70 billion.
70.
Now let's take this into context. In Russia at its peak, which was in 2012, the trade volume was only $40.1 billion between the U.S. and Russia. So if we go back now to Dmitriev coming in and bringing out the receipts, it's a deal-making strategy to get people around the table of where, as we said, where it potentially hurts, of looking at the potential revenue losses that U.S. companies have incurred. But also, you were talking about sanctions, and this is the next thing, about being able to put on the table a negotiating lever for sanctions relief.
Okay, so I mean, we won't speculate on what goes on behind closed doors with these sanction talks, with these, or rather, what kind of mechanisms they'll put in place to relieve these sanctions. But I mean, you've mentioned earlier that you don't think that Putin and Trump will be meeting anytime soon.
No.
But I think looking at the context of historical dealings, it seems like they're going to have a lot of things to work out between the two. I believe that maybe perhaps this is the start of a dialogue rather than and a very long process, to get to reach this rapprochement between these two countries. But I mean, I noticed that, the media was speculating a lot. Lots of armchair analysts were talking about this, but I didn't hear Ukraine being mentioned very much.
No, because Europe, specifically Europe, has wanted to make this summit about Ukraine. Europe, in its pride and bad foreign policy, sees just being at the table for whatever reason, think that makes them relevant. And here it isn't about being at the table. As I said, this summit and I think future discussions are going to have nothing to do with direct negotiations about Ukraine. Of course, the heart of it is Ukraine, but really the heart of it is how can we better this relationship so that we can solve Ukraine. But I also do believe that there is going to be, and here, we like to stick to facts. So this is my professional opinion, although this has been reasserted a little bit by various parties within both Russia and the U.S. There is going to be no direct peace discussions without resolving sanctions and frozen assets. And you'll find it interesting to know that Kirill brought in 324 billion as lost revenue, but the frozen Russian assets, which are frozen and have been seized illegally, dare I say, by the U.S., are to the tune of 300 billion. So I also do think that this is a negotiating tactic to be able to create a discussion around this and also to eliminate sanctions. And it's important to see that in the foreground, whilst there's productive dialogue between the US and Russia, 3 days ago, the European Union reinstated its 16th and most heavy sanctions package on Russia. So this is also one of the reasons that Europe isn't at the table. It isn't capable of being able to engage in productive dialogue at the moment. It isn't willing to engage in any type of diplomatic discussion. So why does it need to be at the table if it's about the bilateral relationships between two countries and explicitly about that?
Also worthy of note is that the U.S. didn't follow that 16th package now, did they?
No, they didn't. They didn't follow that 16th package. Actually, it's the day that Putin talked to Zabulin, a Russian reporter, Russian journalist, about the minerals deal in Russia that we've been discussing. But I think sanctions is one that maybe we should talk a little bit more about. As I said, this is going to be a key lever for any productive dialogue now between the U.S. and Russia. And, you're part of one of the countries who has been actively discussing with the BRICS, the new global south. So how do you perceive the impact of sanctions on the financial system and maybe its direct or indirect impact between business and trade relationships and financial relationships between Saudi Arabia and Russia?
Long story short, I don't think much has changed. It was just a little bit more costly because you would need to find a third neutral country to trade with. So let's say Abu Dhabi, go through an Abu Dhabi business or a business through Dubai or a business through India in order to facilitate that trade between, let's say, Russia and Saudi. I think that when the sanctions hit Russia, all it did was take everything that was above board and just take it under the table. That's literally what happened. And I think maybe the first step that should be part of the negotiation is reinstating Russia in the global financial system, because it's not good for business. And despite the BRICS moving forward, I think they, for now, need to trade in the US dollar, because, like I said, there's inefficiency in switching between currencies 3 or 4 times before you actually can, send your goods or services across. What do you think?
I 100, and you were telling the story also. It's very, there's been actually a lot of tourism to Russia. It's actually increased during the special military operation. It hasn't decreased. Actually, Russia created a new visa regime, which makes it much simpler to visit Russia. And you were mentioning some of your friends and people that you knew who found it very difficult financially.
Yes. Actually, currently there's only one bank in Saudi that can give you a visa or debit card. I'm not sure what kind of structure. It's not a visa, but it is a card. It's a debit card where you can actually use it in the Russian Federation. They either do that or they'll have to go in with cash, open a bank account, and that's just a hassle, isn't it? Because, I mean, personally, if I were to go to Russia, it wouldn't be my first thing to do, going and opening a bank account, me being somebody who likes to be above board, because in my head, I think, okay, before I leave, I'll need to close this bank account because it's a foreign government. I don't know what the laws are with these things, Also worthy of note that Russia is doing its best to accommodate for these foreign tourists. They're making it easier to open such bank accounts. They actually, just 2 days ago, it was all over the Arabic-speaking Twitter sphere, where they have the Russian metro, the Moscow metro, all in Arabic to make things easier for people, Arabic-speaking tourists to go around Russia. It only, like you said, it only increased during the special Russian operation. It didn't decrease. People don't see it as a dangerous place to go. People, I think, especially after the football, after the when was it? Was it 2018? 19?
The Football
20?
World Cup. I have a T-shirt for. I have a T-shirt in my. I'd like to say that it was in 2014.
14, yeah, 14.
I think we're
Yeah.
guys. If we're wrong, I'm not a big football
please correct us
fan,
if I'm wrong. I'm obviously not the biggest football fan, but people they enjoyed Russia. They always thought of Russia as just Moscow. They don't know that it's this huge,
biggest country in the world.
Yeah, it's the biggest country in the world. They have everything,
including a number of time zones.
Yeah. But so just so we don't veer too much off topic, I think that specifically bringing Russia back into the financial system is the correct, is the right step. It's definitely part of the negotiation. And if anything, I'm going to be one of the first people who are looking forward to that happening.
I think it's a very important perspective, because Saudi Arabia was supposed to join the BRICS in January, and it decided, for a number of different reasons, to explore its options. We'll call it like this. And I do think that from the U.S. side, there are definitely incentives to bring back Russia into the financial system. I think we will 100% agree that sanctions on Russia's financial transaction and international financial system, specifically SWIFT, etc., is probably what has caused the biggest headache. I'm not going to say damage, but definitely headache. Simultaneously, it's advanced the discussion.
It's an inconvenience for sure.
Oh, it's a big inconvenience, and it's probably one of the biggest inconveniences. Simultaneously, it's advanced the discussion about de-dollarization quite substantially within the BRICS. So strategically, I do think that the US does have an incentive to bring Russia back into the global financial system, although I have no doubt that Europe will really try and counter that, because it can destabilize the importance of the BRICS a little bit, especially the rising global south. Let's not forget there's two countries which are economically at the helm of the BRICS. I'd say actually three countries. China, Russia, but the UAE has also played a very important role within the financial system. Realistically, full de-dollarization, even though digital currency has been announced last year, this is still years in the making. So I actually think that the reinstating of Russia within the financial system, rather than harm the BRICS, may actually accelerate it, because it won't be as much earmarked as a little bit an alternative state of pariahs. I don't like this word, but this is how the US and some Western economies have been placing it. And also, it may provide a bigger incentive for countries who are a little bit on the fence about the political and economic and resource implications of fully integrating the BRICS to actually develop, we're going to go back to this concept of reciprocity, to develop and integrate more into the BRICS. But this isn't going to be next year. And maybe lastly, to close off on sanctions. For me, and I don't know what you think, but for me, sanctions have been, by and large, a huge failure. I've done quite a lot of research work on sanctions-driven innovation, and sanctions tend to only really work within less industrialized, underdeveloped countries. So if we take the instance of Syria, it has been devastating to Syria. But in industrialized countries, because there's plenty of US sanctions on China also, and this really hasn't hurt it that much, and Russia, the effects actually have been, you could even say, positive towards the economy. It's created a much more resilient economy, specifically in very important primary and secondary goods, manufacturing. We've talked about localization. We've talked about technology substitution. We've talked about the transfer of assets and ownership and the higher degree of localization of technologies. And it's a point of pride amongst many Russian citizens about how resilient its economy has been. So I think this is one of the points moving forwards where a lot of people will tell you, and I, as somebody who's researched this extensively, will say actually sanctions have had the opposite effect on the Russian economy and have actually probably propelled it to perform much better and to become very manufacturing and technology driven. Everything that the US economy is trying to do. So this is going to be interesting to see in the future what this holds in terms of a balancing act and in terms of holding on to this resilient, sovereign national economic system.
Okay. So is it fair to say that specifically with Russia, sanctions, actually were good for the Russian economy and bad for the EU. It didn't really hurt the US much, but I can see that it really did hurt the US, the Europeans that sanctioned. It kind of like felt like a shot in the foot, if that makes any sense.
I would like to say, I think no sanctions are good. Sanctions can be specifically in the short term, as I said, within an industrialized country, and we've seen with the financial system, it can have economic shocks. And we're not going to get too much in detail towards that, but it has had a ripple effect on the Russian economy. I mean, inflation is at a record high, and actually employment and unemployment is as a record low. So it has created some economic ripples. I think it's created resilience and more innovation, which are always positive indicators. Now it's about looking forwards. And one of the things that I would be concerned about, well, not concerned isn't the right word, but one of the things that I would be attentive about is retaining, as I said, economic sovereignty in the face of potential economic cooperation with the United States, and specifically joint ventures and shared economic interests, which may be the outcome, be it in 6 months or a year's time or even 2 years' time, of what are those nascent talks. And how Russia, because the US is definitely going to do it, how Russia can continue protecting and favoring its economy and that of its businesses and citizens. And this is where the Saudi model and that of Saudi Arabia, of Singapore, of other states who've played a very good balancing act between being very outwards looking and inviting investment, international investment, collaboration, and technology, while simultaneously protecting their local input base, labor base, and ensuring that value creation is retained domestically. So I would have a couple of suggestions and recommendations of best practices that I've seen and which have proven to be very effective. And I'm actually basing this on some of the Saudi model and some of the policies which were implemented. But we're going to see probably JVs, whether it's in resources or in energy. I would personally recommend very similar laws that you have, where there has to be a very high degree of local content, where the assets have to be Russian owned, or at least the US counterparty has to have headquarters in Russia, where there is a strong emphasis on technology transfer and IP, but this is where I then would go with a Chinese model, which is basically any IP generated on soil and used to the benefit of this particular joint venture or asset remains the explicit property of the country in which it has been created. And I would look really at creating economic cooperation partnerships, which focuses on infrastructure, which focuses on job localization, which focuses on being able to fill the gaps, which Russia may not always have, maybe in terms of technology, but mainly in terms of manufacture of equipment and machinery. I mean, this is where sanctions have been quite harmful, because this will create a continued pragmatic balance and, you could say, a dissuasion then to, in the future, proceed with any future conflict, whether it's under a more pro-Russian Trump administration or whatever future administration there will be, so that the economy remains resilient and sovereign. And this should be a policy, frankly, which I think any country should follow.
So as I'm hearing this, and I think what you're trying to, or your suggestion is maybe a sovereign wealth fund to sovereign wealth fund kind of deal. It's not. It's going to be higher up on the ladder. It's going to be very restrictive. It's going to be focused on localization. And am I hearing this right? It's
Look, I think this is what we're seeing anyways. We talked about this during our last episode. It was sovereign wealth fund, Saudi Arabia, to future sovereign wealth fund, the US, to existing sovereign wealth fund. Obviously, it wasn't just Dmitriev. There was, of course, Lavrov and some other people on the table. But if we're going to go with we're making a deal, we're looking at how we can make a deal together, whether it's peace, whether it's business, whether it's economic interest, whether it's dialogue. Yes, because without going down the rabbit hole, we have to understand also that the composition, the demographic composition of the Russian industrial sector is very different to that of the US industrial sector. The US is very private sector led, although I do believe this will change in the next year or two, whilst Russia's industrial sector is, like Saudi Arabia, dominated by state-owned enterprises, which could potentially create asymmetries. So if you bring to the table national funds who have the power to discuss and represent the best interests and therefore then reallocate this capital, and by capital I don't only mean financial. You were saying yesterday, human capital, scientific capital, these different forms of capital to their own domestic ecosystems. This is much better in terms of balancing interest, balancing power, but also being able to get things done at a very large scale. Because here we're not talking about a deal between one little tech company to another. Maybe this will happen, maybe this won't happen. There's plenty of Russian engineers and scientists who work in the US or in Dubai, etc., at a small scale. Now here we're talking infrastructure, large-scale development projects, and those actually may be done also. They maybe won't be done on the soil of either country. Maybe those will be investments elsewhere in the world, India, Saudi Arabia, other places. Therefore, it would be a very smart move to do that. And I do think that this is the intent of what has already started.
okay. Then I have a last question for you. If you were to give a bit of advice to the kingmakers that are sitting down on the table between the Russians and the U.S., what kind of advice would you give, our Russian colleagues?
I would never say that I'm in any position to provide advice on behalf of very capable people on both sides. However, I am extremely optimistic about the potential, because this is the start. This is just the beginning. I'm optimistic that there can be dialogue and perhaps mutual understanding, which can be created. And this is what has lacked also in the last couple of centuries. It's the mutual cultural understanding and willingness to listen to each other. So if there's willingness to listen, if there's willingness to learn, if there's willingness to understand, you don't have to agree, but to understand the other person's perspectives and interests, I'm sure that there'll be an opportunity to align. I do believe that Putin's and his whole negotiating team's response is extremely pragmatic. It's extremely strategic. Maybe to close off, because we haven't really spoken about that, is also the future role of China. This puts an opportunity both in developing potentially future resources, but also by creating dialogue with the US. This could put Russia in a position of strength as maybe not a kingmaker, but an equalizer in this relationship, which could be extremely beneficial to avoiding future unneeded conflicts, and to continue focusing on resilience, because at the end of the day, it's a new world with a different direction, and there's going to be financial flows who, by very default of how they're going to be designed, who are maybe in a manner going to supersede in the long run any institutions. So to be very strategic about those financial flows and use them really to the best. But this would be my honest wish, not advice.
Well, you heard it here. You heard it here, ladies and gents. Tatiana, thank you very much for that very insightful look into the Russia and U.S. summit. I certainly
Khaled,
did
thank
learn
you
a
for
lot.
letting me talk so much today.
Well,
I was so much looking forward to this episode.
You were, I know. you prepped so much for this one, and I like to actually take the moderator seat for a second, and have you actually speak your mind about this thing, because it's something that you're very passionate about, and I knew that you wanted people specifically from the Western audience to understand really where the context was, how we got here, how we reached to where we reached, specifically with the U.S. and Russia relation. And I think we've done a good job with doing that today.
You've done an amazing job. Thank you so much. It was so fun.
Well, as usual, do not forget to like, subscribe, and comment.
Okay.
We'd love to know what you guys think about the episode. What topics you'd like us to tackle next?
Yes, please.
As always, this is me, Khalid bin Walid, and Tatiana Dikeros signing off. Tatiana, sign us off.
Bye, everybody, and see you next episode. Bye, Khalid.
Bye-bye.